It would be hard for me to say what is the stupidest comment I've ever received here at this YouTube channel, what is the stupidest complaint I've ever gotten, but one of them, maybe somewhere in the top 10, is the complaint that when I record this show, I dress up like a medical doctor or a research scientist. Referring to this jacket as making me look like a medical doctor or a research scientist. Guess again. All right, guys, it's just cold enough here in Taiwan that I do feel like I need an extra layer on as I'm recording this now. Talking about two issues, one of which is the ongoing pro-democracy rebellion in the streets of Hong Kong, and the other of which is the entirely phony rebellion in the United Kingdom, in England, called Extinction Rebellion. Now, what do these two political events have to do with each other? Well, they are forever indissolubly linked in my own mind and experience, because about 5 months ago now, a little less than 5 months ago, I spoke to Roger Hallam. So if you don't recognize the name Roger Hallam, he's one of the three public faces of Extinction Rebellion, and I would say he is the more respectable and more erudite sounding of the three major spokespeople who represent that movement. So he's been interviewed on the news many times, on many different news programs, by newspapers, and this sort of thing. And he's one of the founders, one of the people who defined what that movement was. In what circumstances did I speak to him? I attended a vegan event. There was a mass audience, and Roger Hallam, or his glowing specter, appeared before us by Skype or by some other teleconferencing software equivalent to Skype, which is to say he was not there in person. And then they took questions from the audience, and I stepped up and spoke to him, and he replied to me. So I was pleased to have the opportunity to, in effect, speak directly with Roger Hallam, but it was in front of a live studio audience. Now, the first thing I said to him was that he had given me a much more positive impression of his organization and its objectives and its methods in that lecture he just presented to this audience than I had ever gotten from his own website or from his YouTube channel, which was true. I had prepared, I had done some research before coming to this event, and had a really pervasively negative sense of what Extinction Rebellion was all about. And I put to him the question, how confident was he really in what he claimed were the hard facts of social science research, what he claimed were the clear and indisputable lessons of history, basically in which he just claims that this type of very marginal public protest brings about dramatic changes in the history of the world. I said, right now in Hong Kong, so this was true 4 months ago or 5 months ago now, right now in Hong Kong, you see the pro-democracy protests that are tearing the city apart. I could say that again today now, 4 or 5 months later. How do you think that's going to end? That's a movement that represents a much greater percentage of the population, has much more force behind it. It's really achieved the methodology that he set out. It's brought the city to a standstill. It's brought the economy to a standstill. It's completely dominated, the news and parliament and the police and so on. If you really believe in the methodology of Extinction Rebellion, that would basically mean applying the same pattern of activism and disruption that we've seen in Hong Kong, in the city of London, or in the city of Paris, or in the city of Glasgow, Scotland, wherever they manage to pull it off. If this is what you believe in, then the parallel between the two is striking. How do you think the current protests in Hong Kong will end? Still today, this is really a very meaningful and even terrifying question for all of us to reflect on. Now, I probably know somewhat more about the political history of China than the average member of my audience. The Tiananmen Square massacre. The problem with that event historically is that it's not the people who were killed on camera at that location at that time. It's the long shadow of people who disappeared in the weeks and months and decades afterwards. The vast majority of the killings that mattered, that snuffed out the Tiananmen Square pro-democracy movement in China, were not people who were killed by tanks or bulldozers or something at that moment, at that time. Already, every single person's face who attended the event was captured on film and video camera. Yes, all that technology already existed. And believe me, the government of China had the staff to go through all of the footage and identify the people and so on. And the people they couldn't identify, you could interrogate someone else and figure out who that was. People could be tracked down. People's parents could be tracked down. People's grandparents could be tracked down. The whole web of, what was initially a student movement. So they were predominantly young people. Of course, there were some older people, but still, when you look at the footage, what you mostly see are young people at the Tiananmen Square protests. All of their family connections, work connections, their colleagues, their friends, could be tracked down and silenced one way or another. And with a terrifying inexorability, this is what, in the next several years, would unfold in China. Not a massacre in the sense of a unique moment in history. Like in history of India, the Amritsar massacre, where the British military kills a group of people at one protest at one time in one square. The problem is the Chinese government's habit, shall we say, of tracking down and extinguishing opposition. Now, the situation now in Hong Kong, you will notice that many of the confrontations between students and the police, or between students and journalists, sometimes they're legitimate journalists, sometimes they're ostensible journalists who are suspected to be working for the Chinese government, but it makes no matter. Very often the students become extremely angry if someone photographs their face up close and they start attacking that journalist or start attacking that police officer. And I think that is because they're aware that the threat against their life will never end. Right? Now, it is possible that the government of China will wear kid gloves, as the saying goes. It's possible they'll talk to some of these young people and say, look, we've got your name on a list. We're watching you. We know exactly what you did during the protests. We have videotape footage. We have photographs. And, maybe we won't put you in a gulag today or tomorrow. Maybe we won't kill you or imprison your family. But if you don't conform all the way from now on, it's going to be game over. It's quite possible they'll do that. The current generation of the Communist Party, they're genteel, although menacing, in their methods of repressing dissent. And, even a government as brutal and terrifying as Saudi Arabia, you might be surprised if you start going over the human rights record how often it is that they hold back from just killing their enemies, how often is they just have somebody come and knock at the door and explain what the situation is and ask people to comply rather than disappear. So that's kind of the best case scenario imaginable for the young people involved. Now, again, I'm sharing this with you because I think some of you might be looking with incomprehension at the ferocity of the Hong Kong protesters, when indeed the police themselves are quite nice towards them. I mean, it sounds ridiculous to say, but it's true. The Hong Kong police who are on duty themselves, they're not some kind of brutal, terrible, authoritarian force. They're the normal police officers of the city of Hong Kong. And yet, these student protesters really fight with fear of their lives. And that's because it's not the police who are meeting them now face-to-face at this moment that are the problem. The massacre is not going to happen here and now in the streets of Hong Kong. Over 6 months or over 6 years, over a long period of time after the protests end. If these young people, and again, they're predominantly young people, I don't know if they're entirely young people, but anyway, if these protesters do not escape to Taiwan or California or Paris, France, if they don't escape to some other country, if they don't get some kind of refugee status, then indeed, at a minimum, their name will be on a list, and it is quite likely they will be hunted down and killed. So this gives the protests a very different sort of mood, spirit, tenacity. There's nothing like the fear for one's own life, and the sense that by participating in these protests already, They've sacrificed their future. They've sacrificed any possible career they might have, if not put themselves in real peril of disappearing into a prison, into a political re-education camp, into being tortured, or into being executed entirely. Now, by contrast, the man I spoke to at Extinction Rebellion, Roger Hallam, he managed to get himself put in prison over rather silly and contrived circumstances, where he went and had a picnic with a drone. But the drone, the drone, you mean here, a remote-controlled flying toy, and it was just a toy. But the toy didn't have a battery in it. He intentionally set up a situation so he'd get arrested, but in fact, it was impossible for him to fly the drone and cause a problem. He had a picnic adjacent to the airport, and nevertheless, he was put in prison briefly, and then I assume pled his case. What you can see with all the British footage is that the police in the United Kingdom are being as sympathetic as they possibly can toward what is ultimately a destructive form of public protest. And I would like to announce very plainly that we can now say Extinction Rebellion has failed. They may not say it's over. I think it genuinely already is over. And like so many political movements in our time, it has begun and ended right here on YouTube. This is in itself a reason to get on YouTube, guys, if you care about politics. YouTube may not be the poetry of our times, but it really is the political agora of our times, shall we say. Anyway, they are still to this day being interviewed by major mainstream news broadcasting companies. Still to this day. Those interviews are going on. And nevertheless, they're uploading videos to YouTube with 1,000 views, 1,500 views. They manage to get a celebrity to appear, and then maybe they get 3,000 views. You know, these kinds of numbers. All right? So, again, if my own channel gets this number of viewers, of course, there's nothing surprising with this. People only see these videos because they know me, or because one of you literally emails a friend with the link or sends the link to somebody through Facebook. That is the only promotion for this channel. There's nothing else. I don't even post to Reddit anymore. I used to in years past, and I lost patience with it. So I don't attempt to promote or advertise this channel in any way. When you are receiving the promotion of being on the front page of the newspaper, being interviewed on mainstream radio, mainstream television again and again, and you present yourself as the leaders of a mass movement, and a mass movement that has received a considerable amount of money in donations and has organization and so on behind it, isn't it a worrying sign when in that context you're only getting 1,200 views, 3,000 views on YouTube, so on and so forth, when the world has simply gotten tired of hearing your message? Now, again, we have to compare Extinction Rebellion to the promises that defined their movement and the methods they endorsed. They said again and again, this is not a protest, it's a revolution, it's a rebellion. They said again and again that they had something new and different to offer, that this wasn't the same as every other street protest that had been before. They said they were going to take over the British House of Parliament by force. That is not unprecedented in the history of England. That's happened several times before in the history of England. They failed to do that. In case you haven't heard, what they did was a 100% typical series of street protests that accomplished nothing except it created the careers of the three leaders of this organization to now be talking heads on the news and opinion circuit, especially in England, especially in Europe, and to some extent internationally and around the world. It has provided at least these three people with fame and money and power and status. And in every other way, their movement is a failure. Right? And among other things, something they promised was to innovate, was to do something new and different. And as I've already stated, look, you can look at the footage of what actually happens at their protests. There is absolutely nothing new. All they did was get together a bunch of hippies on the streets, holding up slogans written on cardboard, and they called this a rebellion. Right? it's very instructive and very useful to contrast what's happening in Hong Kong right now, all right? In its spirit and in the terror of the people who participate. What's going on in Hong Kong right now is a rebellion. I wouldn't say a revolution, but it is an active rebellion. And what they're demanding is simply democracy. Now you tell me how that's going to end. I have the same question for you now that I had for Roger Hallam. Because Roger Hallam's claim, it's not worth repeating in greater detail, I find it completely phony and completely insincere, is that if you just study the history of political movements, you can thoughtlessly and recklessly and optimistically embrace this form of activism because it basically always works. That, people wanted gay rights and then they got gay rights, and people wanted civil rights for African Americans and they got civil rights for African Americans. It's an unbelievably facile and insincere interpretation of history, every bit as specious and phony and false as the dialectics of Marxism and communism were before it. All right, sorry, but here off the top of my head, I could give you a more meaningful summary of how it was in the United States that civil rights legislation got passed. Has a lot to do with the assassination of JFK. Has a lot to do with the guy who took over presidency of the United States immediately thereafter, Lyndon Johnson and his wife, Lady Bird Johnson. You know what? I hate to tell you this. There's a really specific legislative history and specific political context that was not created by rebellion on the streets. It wasn't created by a bunch of hippies holding up placards. It really wasn't, okay? And then you can examine that history and you can indeed reflect on what would be the implications for what we would do now in advocating for ecology, veganism, animal rights, advocating against climate change, or trying to improve aerial pollution, ocean pollution, what have you. Right? Those might be interesting questions to ask. People like Extinction Rebellion are not asking those questions, and they're not answering those questions. And for me, it will remain a tremendously memorable, even if minor, turning point in my own life. That when I asked Richard Hallam straight to his face, if you really believe this theory you're advancing, well then look at what's happening right now in the streets of Hong Kong, and you tell me what's going to happen next. Because you're claiming that this is a cannot fail strategy for a bright and powerful future, that this is going to transform government, that this is going to transform public policy like clockwork. This is the heartbeat of history. You've looked back at the history of the world, you've used your social science methods, and you've extracted this transcendent truth that is at all times consistent in all these different cultural and political circumstances. You tell me the protests that are happening right now in Hong Kong, and this is what I asked him, why do you think the end of this story will be any less tragic than the pro-democracy protests that we saw before in Tiananmen Square? And the truth is, Roger Hallam did not have an answer for that question then. He still doesn't have an answer for that question now. And that's why Extinction Rebellion is a failure. Because it's led by idiots.